Welcome to the National Arts Club and welcome to our presentation, Fashion Lines. I'm Gordon Kendall and our returning guest is Annette Becker, Director of Texas Fashion Collection, with a fascinating presentation tonight about that collection. And if I may say, very briefly, that's her day job as director, but she is taking time out from her dissertation to join us tonight. So double thank you to Annette for doing that. But before you meet her and hear of her presentation, just brief information about the National Arts Club. We are at 15 Gramercy Park South in New York City, and our new location on the internet is nacnyc.org. We are National Arts Club is a 501c3 not-for-profit arts organization with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote the interest in arts among the American people. And for over 125 years, the club has done that through 150 free events, presentations, concerts, open to the public in our physical space here on Gramercy Park, and of course online and through all the socials. Very exciting lineup of new projects to be on the lookout for, and keep in touch with us on the internet, where there's always something new to find. Let's see, we do have a question and answer session after the end of the presentation. But for right now, enough about me and the club. Let's hear from Annette. Welcome back, Annette.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the introduction, Gordon. And thank you to everyone who's attending this National Arts Club program. I'm really grateful for this audience, which I'm sure is national, if not international, and is a really lovely opportunity for us to share a little bit about the Texas Fashion Collection, which is based in Denton, Texas. I'm sure maybe a few of you have been here before. We're not necessarily known as a fashion capital, but really through the incredible collection we have, we are able to tell stories of local, regional, national, and international importance. So right now I'm going to switch to sharing my screen and then start my presentation for you. So my goals for this evening are to share both a little bit of information about the Texas Fashion Collection on the chance we're new to you and we might be able to serve you as our audience, again, locally or even internationally, through in-person research appointments, through virtual research appointments, or ways we might be able to help you connect with our collection. After sharing a little bit about the Texas Fashion Collection, who we are and what we do, I'm really looking forward to sharing information about some of the designer and donor lineages that we can see in our collection. There are such robust ways we can explore stories from the past that are deeply human through dress history and through our holdings. And I'm really looking forward to sharing some of those stories with you this evening. So to begin, I'd like to share a little bit more about the Texas Fashion Collection. We are an archive of nearly 20,000 historic and designer garments and accessories, housed as part of the University of North Texas and part of UNT's College of Visual Arts and Design. The Texas Fashion Collection has a very broad-ranging set of holdings. Our oldest pieces are from between the years 300 and 400. We have some Roman sandals that were dug up from the Thames River in an archaeological excavation. Those are both the oldest pieces we have, which makes them very interesting and fascinating, but also some of the most hideous to view because petrified leather is never winning any beauty contests. And then our collection includes pieces from just the past few years. So what you're seeing here is a photo of inside our collection storage area where you can see garments literally floor to ceiling, stored 2 stories tall in this space. And this is a view down just one of 9 aisles in our collection storage area. And at the background of the photograph, you can even see boxes lined up that hold the thousands of accessories we have in our collection. We're really grateful to have this incredible set of holdings at UNT and at the Texas Fashion Collection. You might wonder, Denton, Texas, not necessarily always a fashion capital in people's minds. How did these things end up here? We're quite lucky that because we're so close to the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, that our collection is really tied in with the cultural history and the fashion industry history of our region. So our collection was started started in 1938 by the Dallas-based department store Neiman Marcus. Neiman Marcus leadership started collecting contemporary clothing at their store and began the seed collection that later formed our holdings. Neiman's kept that collection for just under 30 years, then transferred their holdings to what was called the Dallas Museum of Fashion, which was largely run as a grassroots initiative by people working in the Dallas fashion industry, which in the 1960s was the second largest fashion industry in the country, second only to New York. So you can imagine the robust industrial power, creative power, economic power, and cultural power that came with that. The collection was with the Dallas Museum of Fashion until 1972 when it came to our university. And for the past 53 years, our collection has really been framed as a research resource here. So with that, we host a lot of researchers in our space. Obviously, being part of a university, our primary audience tends to be students and scholars. So you can see in the photograph on the left, some students who are working in our space. They took a workshop that was about mount making for accessories. So they were getting to try their hand at working with ethafoam and stockinette to create mounts for some of our artifacts. And you can see behind them a series of garments, all of those pieces by the designer Adrian, who's best known for some of his Hollywood designs from the 1930s and 40s. Those were mounted as part of a pop-up exhibition that a student intern curated. So we're really grateful to be able to promote student research in our space, but then also promote professional development. And while we usually work with students, we do welcome people who are community members, freelance researchers, or independent researchers, and even folks from within the industry. So the photograph you can see on the right side shows two young men who came to our collection last summer. They were sent to us by their boss, Kim Jones, who at that point was the creative director of Dior Men and is still the creative director of Fendi. Kim Jones sent these two young men who are part of his design team to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, recognizing that American fashion consumers have a lot to say about high fashion, even high fashion based in Europe. So they were really excited to see some of the really beautiful pieces in our collection by Dior and Balenciaga and many of the famous French designers they're used to being around. But then they were also particularly taken by some of the Southwestern themed pieces in our holdings. So we're always happy to host researchers. As long as people want to learn something in our space, they're welcome. Of course, we try to make sure that a broader audience has opportunities to access our holdings. So while we don't have our own dedicated exhibition space, we often work with cultural institutions to share our collection. So sometimes that means we mount exhibitions in spaces where we're partnering with those cultural institutions to curate our own content that then is hosted by their space. We've worked with history museums, art museums, and even the photograph on the left shows one of our regular collaborations with North Park Center, a shopping mall in Dallas that has its own fine art collection and has, ready-to-wear stores that have sort of fast fashion brands, but then also some of the luxury retailers that we're used to seeing in really high-end fashion retail spaces. So this is just one example of some of the many exhibitions that we've had on view in the shopping mall, just trying to make our collection as accessible as possible. We do often regularly loan artifacts to other collecting institutions as well. So what you can see on the right side of the photo of the screen is a photograph of a mannequin dramatically leaning back with a really beautiful Givenchy couture dress on. This was borrowed by the Metropolitan Museum of Art for an exhibition exploring American fashion a few years ago. This piece by Givenchy was mounted in a room designed by Tom Ford that was telling the story of the Battle of Versailles when American and French designers were pitted against each other on an international fashion stage. And sadly, it looks like our Givenchy piece was slayed, not as a fashion slay, but as in taken out by the fist of a mannequin wearing an Oscar de la Renta piece. So we're really grateful to be on the radar of many colleagues that work in collecting institutions that mount exhibitions so we can really expand access to our holdings. On the chance that physically coming to Denton, Texas, or seeking out one of our exhibitions is a challenge for you, we do encourage you to go to our website and then find the link to the UNT Digital Library that's referenced here. Our team really works hard to digitize our collection, and right now we have records for over 10,000 of our nearly 20,000 pieces accessible to anyone with an internet connection. So through this link, you can find over 67,000 images that are accessible again to anyone who'd like to see them. This is a really important research resource for people from a broad variety of interests and perspectives. We'd encourage you to look up everything from maternity fashion to historic undergarments to t-shirts to couture in our collection. This is just a really great way to get an introduction to what's in our holdings. But of course, this evening, our goal is not just for you all to become indoctrinated in the really great ways that the Texas Fashion Collection functions, but instead to really explore some of the ways that our collection offers case studies and how we might think about the ways that designers and donors work together to shape fashion history, and the ways that there are really lineages within fashion families, and then with the ways that collectors can interact in holdings. So my goal for this evening is to highlight really two collectors in our that have contributed to the Texas Fashion Collection and celebrate the ways that they have created an enduring fashion legacy, both for themselves as cultural patronesses, but then also in the ways that they have worked very closely with designers to patronize them and help shape the way that fashion design continues to exist and thrive. I would be remiss if I didn't share that much of my research is building on the legacy and the lineage of researchers that have been empowered in our space. So some of the research I'm sharing tonight is building on the work done by the Texas Fashion Collection's former director, Myra Walker. She mounted an exhibition in 2007 that highlighted the same theme of this publication, Balenciaga and his legacy, really celebrating the holdings in our collection created by Cristobal Balenciaga, and then also the designers who worked with Balenciaga to develop themselves essentially through apprenticeships with Balenciaga. And in this publication, Myra Walker also touches on some of the ways that donors have shaped the way we tell those stories at the Texas Fashion Collection. So if I'm acknowledging designer and donor lineages, I should also be acknowledging the scholarly lineage that I'm part of. The next figure we're going to talk about, and one that really serves as a protagonist for us this evening, is this very striking figure. This is a photograph of Claudia Hubert de Osborne, a woman who has donated over 400 designs to the Texas Fashion Collection. Claudia is perhaps a figure that you all have not heard of before, but our legacy is really wrapped up in the way that she was a patroness of the fashion arts. So Claudia was born to a lower middle class family in southern Texas. I've read that her father was a county clerk, so essentially a working class person who had a stable job, but not an abundance of resources. As part of the great history of Texas and its economic and cultural development, Claudia belonged to one of those families that struck oil. And from the moment that that happened, she was launched from her relatively geographically and culturally confined existence in southern Texas into what today would be considered the international jet set. So needless to say, the way that she engaged with her closet really changed once some of that Texas petroleum money was fueling possibilities for her. The Texas Fashion Collection, again, is lucky to be the recipient of over 400 pieces that Claudia collected and saved over the course of her lifetime. The pieces that represent her wardrobe and our holdings are expansive and fascinating, and really quite beautiful. Because I don't want to give too narrow of an understanding of what her collecting included, I thought I'd share these two examples. We have on the left side of the screen a suit by Gilbert Adrian, again, a fashion designer who started out in Hollywood costume. If you can picture the strong shoulder pads and squared off shoulders of, say, Joan Crawford in the 1930s, you might credit some of that look to Adrian. This, I think, is one of the most fabulous ensembles we have by this designer, again, donated by Claudia, because this, to me, has some surrealist inspiration. The pink and black spots are not just random patterns, but are mimicking the patterns of Holstein cows eyebrows. And if you look carefully, you might notice it looks like there's some black splotches on some of the pink areas. Those are all flies being represented on this cow pattern suit. So I could imagine this piece is likely inspired by some of the ways that Salvador Dali and surrealists were really inspiring textile design that have been more explored by dress historians through the work of Elsa Schiaparelli, but here show a really beautiful example created by an American designer. On the right side, you can see a beautiful handbag by the brand Roberta di Camerino, created by Julia Cohen, a Venice-based designer. I think this is a really delightful and slightly campy example of really high fashion, again, donated by Claudia, that we have this really beautiful evening bag with a metal closure and kiss closure. You can see the metal frame. And then that shape and style are being echoed by the smaller coin purse that's attached to the outside of the bag, creating a sort of meta bag within bag. So clearly, Claudia really enjoyed engaging in high fashion and thought really expansively about the innovations that were being created through high fashion in Euro-American spaces, really from the 1930s through the 1970s. So while Claudia's contributions to our collection are immense, really, I think the deepest way that we can explore Claudia's relationship with high fashion is through her relationship with Cristobal Balenciaga. So Claudia, again, was born in southern Texas. Her family struck oil. She was launched into the international jet set. And then she really became even more connected with Spanish culture and European culture through her husband, who's pictured here with her. From what I've read, he was the heir to a brandy fortune, was really involved in some of the elite society in Spain. And Claudia really wanted to shape her wardrobe to reflect, I think, Spanish culture and really high fashion at the time. I think the primary way that Claudia shaped her legacy through fashion is by developing a deep and close relationship with Cristobal Balenciaga. We can see a nod to that here with this really beautiful hat that she's wearing that is represented in our collection. This hat is covered in bird of paradise feathers, materials that are rarely used today because of concerns about disrupting populations of animals. But here, I think at least they're used in a really incredible way. So Claudia really developed a close relationship with Cristobal Balenciaga, and based on the holdings that we have, commissioned over 200 examples of haute couture from this designer that she saved and then decided were worthy of donating to the Texas Fashion Collection. With this, we might really appreciate the way that couturiers and clients really developed relationships. So while most of us buy our clothing through a ready-to-wear system, where we go into a store where preset sizes are available, and we can pretty quickly and easily make a decision about what we want and even grab something that day, ideally. The system of haute couture is much more involved. So even today, if someone is to commission an example of couture for themselves, it involves looking at different styles, selecting one that you want to have made for yourself, potentially even being in dialogue with that individual designer to perhaps make design tweaks based on the needs of your life and your wardrobe. And then that piece is custom created for your body. So there's something much more involved, much more intimate, and much more about relationship building through the system of haute couture. And I think we can really see that through the way that Claudia developed her wardrobe and essentially worshipped at the altar of Balenciaga in developing her collection. I think we can really appreciate too the ways that these collectors and designers, these couture patrons and these couturiers were really working in tandem to create cultural meaning. So one way we can think about that is just that in our collection, if you go to our collection records online, you can pretty easily search for Cristobal Balenciaga and see hundreds of examples come up. So we in fashion communities tend to push forward designers in our conversations. So if we were to describe this dress, we would likely describe it as an example of haute couture created by Cristobal Balenciaga. And we might think about the ways that Balenciaga's cultural background and his ways of making are really evident in this piece. So for example, Balenciaga, as a Spanish designer working in Paris, was really interested in drawing on his own cultural heritage. So some scholars have really linked the hyper formal, very stiff structured way that this garment was created created with hoops on the inside to make a really full skirt. Some scholars have connected this with, say, Spanish court dress from centuries before the 1950s when this was created. We might also appreciate the way that Balenciaga is really seen as a sculptor in fabric. So the really textural way that silk taffeta is being used in this skirt is a clear indication of Balenciaga's prowess with these materials. However, we might also think about the ways that this is not only a Balenciaga dress, but a dress that really shows Claudia Hubert de Osborne's perspective as a person who commissioned this specific example to be worn. So as much as this belongs to Balenciaga, in many ways it belongs to her too. So here we have a photograph of Claudia stepping out of a car, perhaps on her way to the opera, wearing this really incredibly beautiful piece, again, that she had custom made for herself. We are quite lucky that Claudia felt so invested in her relationship with Balenciaga and with these individual artifacts that when she donated these materials, she left us some handwritten notes to help us understand how special they were to her. So I wanted to share some of her notes just with this piece. So bear with me, we have a few slides that add some text. So on this slide, we can appreciate the way that Claudia is really in love with the details of this piece, really thinking about the design decisions that Balenciaga made from the fuchsia taffeta, the chantilly lace. You'll notice she put real hoops in all caps in her handwritten note, and even loving the tiny bows that sort of punctuate the sleeves that are on this piece. Perhaps she's editorializing, saying this looks very Scarlett O'Hara, drawing on perhaps her own experiences as an American woman from the South. But we can imagine the way then that might be a foil or counterpoint to the way Balenciaga might imagine this dress telling his own cultural story. Then we might really think about the way this dress, once it left Balenciaga's atelier, then was activated by Claudia. It's still his dress, but she's the one who's bringing this piece to life. So she also shares that the first time she wore this was to La Scala when she was in Milan, that this really caused a sensation. So we might think about how pieces like this often debut in fashion shows, maybe in Balenciaga's atelier, but once the custom piece is commissioned, then it goes on to be part of these fashion wearers' lives. And now we have another bit of quote, really thinking about the way that Claudia Hubert de Osborne styled this to make it part of her. So noting that she wore this with shoulder-length white gloves and fresh gardenias, which you can see here represented in her hair. So while Balenciaga created this dress, Claudia Hubert de Osborne created the rest of the context of the ensemble that she's wearing this. And then, of course, it's the end of her note. My husband is furious that I gave this up. I think really gives us a look into the personal ways that wardrobes function for individual people. We can easily imagine the way that, Claudia commissioning hundreds of Balenciaga pieces, what an expense that was likely, the amount of space that would take up in someone's wardrobe, but then maybe also for people who weren't wearing these things but were close to Claudia, the way you might develop, affection or an affinity towards pieces that are in your loved one's wardrobe. So we can imagine maybe the many facets that come up that might be suggested by a husband being furious by this garment being donated to the Texas Fashion Collection. Again, I think this set of quotes is really powerful and sharing the ways that a designer's legacy and work is being translated through these donors and their relationships with these garments. I want to share a few other examples of pieces by Cristobal Balenciaga that really relate deeply to Claudia Hubert de Osborne and her life. So this is a really lovely example of a maternity ensemble that was created by Balenciaga for Claudia. When we think about high fashion, again, we often think about designers having dictates that then fashion consumers must follow, choose to follow or not. I think this is a really lovely example that shows the close relationship relationship Balenciaga had with Claudia, and that to my knowledge, Balenciaga was not advertising that he could make maternity ensembles. This is something that really is the product of the close relationship that Balenciaga and Claudia had, that she had this need in her life and went to Balenciaga to address that. And then how lovely that this, designer that Christian Dior called the master of us all, who I would argue was one of the most influential fashion designers of the 20th century, that he was willing to meet a client where she was to create a maternity ensemble that meant she could wear Balenciaga through many stages of her life. What a relationship they must have had. Another really great and personal example is this really lovely red velvet dress that has been accented with faux pearls of varying sizes that have been hand stitched to the surface of this gown. We're told through donor records that Claudia wore this as her Christmas dress. So recognizing that there are these deeply personal moments and celebratory moments when couture comes into people's lives, that this was something that was really special for Claudia to wear. And again, thinking about Balenciaga creating something that had seasonal interest in that way is maybe not how we always celebrate him, but thinking about his work within the context of a wearer's life, I think brings a different layer of understanding to the impact of his design. From what I've been told, Claudia also commissioned to have this piece be made more than once because it was such a favorite of hers that she actually wore it out and had to have a second one made. Maybe I aspire to be so fabulous that I ask Balenciaga to remake a dress for me. What an incredible, again, example of how close their relationship was. One more example. So from what I've read, this piece created by Balenciaga was actually with the same sort of style for the main dress as the Christmas dress that we just looked at, but it has this incredibly beautiful bustle train attached to the back. This is probably one of the most special examples of Balenciaga's work in our collection and is one that has been noted by the Balenciaga archives and its former directors as being one of the most special examples of Balenciaga's work. To my knowledge, this is the only example of this that exists in the entire world. So Claudia was really making possible some of Balenciaga's dreams for what could be created. I find this dress as an art historian, to be something incredibly potent to unpack, as the dress is made out of black velvet, and then everywhere we're seeing those white streaks on the bustle, each one of those is an individual tail from an ermine. So ermines are a type of animal, sort of like a mink, that has been farmed, and then those populations used to create fur ensembles. So today we have varying levels of, I guess, comfort with ways that furs do and do not work in the fashion industry. You can imagine at the very least that this is an incredible example of opulence, as every single tail you're seeing was a different ermine that had to be ranched to be able to create this dress. And again, from what I've been told, Balenciaga even gave Claudia a little bag of extra tails in case perhaps they were hand stitched on, and perhaps in case one fell off through what I can only imagine is not rigorous activity that Claudia is engaged in wearing this piece. We might think about adding some additional fashion history context to what it means for Claudia and Balenciaga to be using this material. So, for example, we might think about the ways that ermine is a material historically associated with royalty. In this incredible portrait of King Louis XIV, we can see that he's wearing this really elaborate cape that has velvet, that has the fleur-de-lis on it, really signifying the political power, the cultural power of the French monarchy. Everything about this portrait is to communicate power. So with that, if we look at the lining of this cape, you can see that it's white and studded with black dots. Every single one of those black dots is a tail of one of these ermines. So historically, there were sumptuary laws that dictated what people at different levels of status in society were allowed or disallowed from wearing. And these ermine were really limited to the most elite people that existed. Other people were disallowed from wearing these because they communicated such power. Again, if they're being used in this Rigaud portrait, clearly they're a symbol of power because that's what this portrait is communicating. Even if we think beyond just, this early 18th century example, we might also think then about like Napoleon and the way that he chose to have himself portrayed here in an Ingres painting, where everything about this image is communicating power. And again, we can see through the robe that Napoleon is wearing that ermine are still being used as a signifier of royal power, of God-given power, of colonizing power. So this material holds a lot of significance. Then what does it mean for this woman, Claudia Hubert de Osborne, born to a middle-class family in southern Texas, to be not only engaging with Balenciaga, who is at the height of the international fashion pyramid, but is also working with her to use these ermine tails for a garment that she is wearing? What an incredible testament to the cultural power that fashion has, the power that Balenciaga had, and the power that the women who were purchasing these couture pieces really had. All of that is materially communicated through this piece that Claudia commissioned from Balenciaga. Balenciaga really had an incredible amount of power in the fashion industry, really through the 1950s and through part of the 1960s. As we think about how some of our donors and collectors were really thinking about their relationships with Balenciaga, we might also appreciate that Balenciaga was at different phases of his career, especially towards the end of it. So here we have an ensemble donated by Claudia from 1967, the year before Balenciaga decided to retire. We can appreciate the way fashion history is infused through Balenciaga's pieces that we've looked at, but also the ways that he's attempting to keep up with contemporary fashion trends. So here we have this hot pink hostess ensemble with fitted cigarette pants and a tunic length dress. So Balenciaga is really thinking about the needs of Claudia here, creating a hostess ensemble, but also trying to keep up with these, the styles that were so popular in the mid and late 1960s. As an example that usually makes me laugh quite a bit, here's another example that we date to around 1968, the year that Balenciaga decided to leave the fashion industry. You can see that he's really making an effort to maintain really high quality in his fashion construction, but there's something just a little awkward about the way that he's engaging with the style of a romper. He understands this is where fashion is headed, but because he's really such a storied designer, trying to keep up with the times, I think was really a challenge for him. But Claudia stayed with him the entire way. Sadly, when Balenciaga decided to leave fashion in 1968, the way Claudia described it in her notes, it was really just like a moment of death for her, that she mourned the loss of Balenciaga and the way that he had really shaped her understanding of herself and the way she cultivated her wardrobe. Luckily, Balenciaga did not exist in a vacuum, and he had his own fashion lineage. So one of the designers who trained under Balenciaga, Balenciaga here represented on the left. On the right, we have a portrait of Hubert de Givenchy, a designer who is famous today in his own right, but really in the 1960s was still getting his career going. He'd opened a couture house, was working very closely with Audrey Hepburn. But he was still accumulating couture clients. Balenciaga directed Claudia to go to Givenchy. So I can imagine, in my own wardrobe, how lucky to have Givenchy as my backup option. But I think Balenciaga specifically recommending Givenchy is really a testament to how much he trusted a person that he had trained, and also knew that Claudia was used to the couture system and would probably benefit from working with Givenchy, who was part of that system too. So there are several ways that we can really appreciate the ways that Givenchy and Balenciaga and their relationships provided some continuity, provided part of that design lineage for Claudia. So here on the screen, we can see on the left an example of Balenciaga's hostess ensemble. But then on the right, we can see a hostess ensemble that Givenchy made for Claudia just a few years later. So we can really appreciate that there are great similarities in how these are designed, that clearly there is a relationship between Balenciaga and Givenchy's designs, especially when filtered through the needs and taste of Claudia. We might also appreciate here another example. I think really beautiful tailoring is something that Givenchy is better known for. And we can really appreciate in these two examples the very careful attention to tailoring and how pattern pieces are being cut out of this window pane plaid fabric. I especially appreciate looking at the notched collar. You can appreciate the way the black lines are accentuating the linearity of that on the example on the right, and the way the white lines are accentuating that in the piece on the left. So again, we can see a lot of relationships between the way these designers are working. Claudia continued her relationship with Givenchy, and even Balenciaga was occasionally called on by Givenchy to work with him to support Claudia. So the story that's been handed to me about this ensemble, which includes a formal coat that went over a matching dress and then came with pumps designed by Roger Vivier. The story I've been told is that this ensemble was custom created for Claudia, and it bears a Givenchy label, but that this piece was so special to Claudia that she requested that Balenciaga come and help work on it. And from what I've been told, this might have been one of the last pieces that Balenciaga advised Givenchy on before he passed away in 1972. I'm told that this piece was worn by Claudia during the wedding of I think the granddaughter of Generalissimo Franco in Spain. So you could perhaps also imagine that Balenciaga, as a Spaniard, probably felt connected to systems of power there, even if they are, fascist in nature. And that perhaps he felt compelled to participate in this fashion moment as a Spanish designer, creating something to be worn for the Spanish cultural event. So with that, we can really appreciate the ways that Balenciaga really had a close relationship with Claudia, and then the ways that Claudia's relationship was maintained with couture and maintained with Balenciaga through a relationship she then cultivated with Givenchy, that really to appreciate both Givenchy and Balenciaga's work, especially in our collection, we also need to consider Claudia, that they become sort of like this fashion family and how we can consider them together. I do have one more set of examples I'd love to share with you all that show the ways that this isn't just a bubble of how we can interpret pieces in our collection. And the next figure I'd like to highlight is Mercedes Bass, an arts and cultural philanthropist who right now is based out of Fort Worth, New York, and Aspen. She's a woman who has made an incredible legacy for herself, primarily supporting symphonies and the opera, but she's also an incredible patroness of the fashion arts and has donated over 1,000 garments to the Texas Fashion Collection. She is by far the donor who has most shaped our holdings and shaped the ways that taste and designers are represented in our collection. Mercedes Bass, as someone who has great social demands and great aesthetic demands on her wardrobe, certainly has engaged some of the most important fashion designers and most famous fashion designers of the 20th and 21st centuries. And she serves as a point of continuity with some of the designers that we just looked at. So for example, we have incredible holdings of work by Hubert de Givenchy, I think nearly 400 pieces in our collection. And here you can see those represented in the photograph in the center of the screen, a Givenchy evening dress created for Claudia Hubert de Osborne with this really beautifully draped lightweight fabric that really uses the wearer's form as the armature for the shape of this beautiful evening dress. Then we can appreciate on the right side of the screen a very similar design created by Givenchy just over a decade later, commissioned by Mercedes Bass. So essentially in our holdings where Claudia Claudia Hurd de Osborne's wardrobe sort of closes, then those stories through Givenchy are told through Mercedes Bass's wardrobe, that really were able to tell the story of basically Hubert de Givenchy's entire career through these two collectors who had very similar taste. Here we might appreciate another example. We have a piece on the left by Cristobal Balenciaga, donated by Claudia Hurd de Osborne. And on the right, we have an example donated by Mercedes Bass, designed by Oscar de la Renta. Oscar is another designer who was trained by Balenciaga and really came up in the system of haute couture, learning those design techniques and ways to engage with fashion clients. So we might add Oscar as another, part of our fashion lineages that we're exploring, that we have these designer lineages as we think about Balenciaga and the many people he trained. Paco Rabanne, he trained Andre Carrege, Ungaro, trained Givenchy, and here trained Oscar de la Renta as well. So in our collection, we can see, clearly not one-to-one direct copies, but we can clearly see that these designs have an affinity with each other. And because of these two donors and these three designers, we're able to tell those stories in a really compelling way. Just one more example, because I can't help myself. These green pieces, one by Oscar de la Renta and one by Hubert de Givenchy, both collected by Mercedes Bass. So again, these are not the exact same style, but they show an affinity with each other that I think really makes clear the design lineages for how these folks have been trained. Many of the pieces that Mercedes has gifted to us are by Oscar de la Renta. So we have, I think, around 400 examples of his work in our collection. And I would say 95% of those have been gifted to us by Mercedes Bass. As a person who I think really frames her work as patronage, she has really supported Oscar de la Renta through many stages in his career. So here we see a really beautiful example from when he was really advancing his career in the 1980s, working out of New York City, creating really beautiful evening designs. Luckily, we're able to date this one pretty precisely, both through runway images we found of this design premiering in the fall 1985 collection. But then also we have some Getty Images photographs of Mercedes Bass wearing this dress that same season. And we can really appreciate how beautiful this piece is and the ways many designers would only be able to create something at such a high level of design if they have support and patronage from these collectors, from these people commissioning garments from them. So here we see a really beautiful example of Mercedes Bass supporting Oscar de la Renta through the sort of like early and middle parts of his career. We might then appreciate the way that her support continued for him through when he began as the head of the House of Balmain in Paris. We can really appreciate that in 1990, I think it was the end of 1992, then for 1993 collections, Oscar de la Renta premiered in this new role for him. We can appreciate how challenging that would be, even though Oscar was trained under Balenciaga and understood the couture system, that entering this system as an American designer from a space that tends to be more commercially driven and tends to be really driven by ready-to-wear designs, that Oscar really needed to prove himself that he had the artistic and the design chops to stand up to his competitors in Paris, but also that he had the financial support and the cultural support of people like Mercedes Bass, who would follow him from his namesake brand into this couture space and purchase pieces from that house. I think this piece is a really beautiful example of what Oscar was able to do in that context in Paris again. This piece created in collaboration with the embroidery house Lesage. We can appreciate that this evening jacket is made almost entirely of black netting that has gold holographics, sort of scroll style filigree sandwiched between two pieces of netting. So really innovative approach to textiles. But then also also the center front and at the back neckline and on the cuffs, you can see that there's incredibly dense embroidery and beadwork that makes this piece so formal, so elegant, and so advanced from a surface design standpoint. Clearly, Oscar could work in this Paris context, could work with the business associations that he could create with Lesage, and then brought Mercedes Bass along with her fashion patronage to really launch him into that really advanced level of his career, working both in New York and in Paris. And again, Mercedes Bass is one of the figures who helped facilitate that. I really appreciate in our collection being able to explore these deeply personal stories. We can often think of these fashion designers as abstract figures that are presented in shiny books, presented through garments mounted on mannequins and exhibitions. But I think really when we combine these designers' stories and their work with the stories of the people who commissioned these garments and wore them, we can introduce a lot of humanity into the stories that we're able to tell. And I think that's really the joy of working with holdings at the Texas Fashion Collection, that we get to share not only these stories that have international importance about very famous people, but that at the end of the day, these are all clothes that individual people have worn, and that is why we tend to connect so deeply with dress history and fashion history, because we all clothe ourselves and can relate to the deeply intimate and individual reasons we select garments for ourselves, but then also the way that these garments relate to bigger systems of making and the creative impulses of designers, that we as fashion consumers are constantly in conversation with these designers through our wardrobe, I think can really help us understand the many ways there are to be human and the many ways those ideas are expressed through dress. So thank you for joining me this evening. I appreciate being able to share these stories from our collection and hope you've enjoyed this introduction to the Texas Fashion Collection.
And there we go. I'm back. Thank you, Annette. That was incredible. As a note to our participants, I am on the college. Excuse me. Take two. I am a board member of the College of Visual Arts at the University of North Texas, and have had the opportunity many times to go through the collection. And in fact, I've been down that very row that Annette shows, where she's standing at the end. And I guess the thing that always strikes me as I feel like I know a lot about fashion history, but just being in these garments, I realize it's just a beginning. There's always some incredible story individually about the piece, its construction, and then as Annette has brought out, that these garments don't exist in a vacuum. They don't exist on their own. They exist because there was somebody who cared enough and, quite honestly, had the wherewithal enough to commission them and to continue on with them. And we've had some interesting questions. And Annette, I'm going to draw on your expertise in material culture. And part of material culture, as I understand it from you, is setting the context for these garments. So if you could please explain to us where would a hostess ensemble be worn?
Oh,
What comes
I
into your
love
head?
that question. So one of the really important parts of doing material culture research is understanding that these are objects that we're exploring that circulate in our lived environments. So the way that I often think of material culture is as above ground archaeology, that we're thinking about the objects around us, how they are shaped by human experiences and how we shape our experiences through these objects. So with that, we can really appreciate maybe the design of a hostess ensemble and the materiality that's part of that style, to then think about the environments that it could also be worn in. So we might think about hostess ensembles as a type of clothing that was created for people entertaining at home. So if you are having a rather lavish soiree in your own residence, you might not necessarily want to wear an evening dress in that environment. So, but you still want to communicate an elevated way that you're engaging with your dress. So often hostess ensembles are not evening designs, but use some of the same more luxurious fabrics. However, they still need to reflect their at-home context. So often those styles are a bit less formal. Sometimes they have looser styling to them. So we might think about like caftans are often cast as hostess wear, or we might even think about these pants ensembles, which are really drawing on or I guess an orientalized history of thinking about things like Turkish style pants or harem pants that were worn historically in at-home contexts as a way of women in these less rigorously controlled environments experimenting with what's possible for them to wear. So while Claudia Hubert de Osborne was likely not wearing trousers out in, in popular and in public society in the 1950s and 60s, wearing something like a fitted trouser at home as part of a hostess ensemble would have been deemed appropriate. So again, not as formal as an evening dress, but drawing on some of those same styles or same fabrics, but not like your pajamas or, at real at-home private clothing, but nodding to some of that informality too. So with that, we might, from a material culture standpoint, think about the textiles that are used, the design considerations. We might also think about the environments these are being worn in and the postures required, that we are not sitting upright in maybe a very rigid way like we would at the opera in New York, but instead might be in a more relaxed posture on a couch at our house. And often hostess ensembles relate to those interior design decisions.
I see. Thank you. And to that same end, I'm guessing that something at the opposite spectrum, that something like uh the ermine trimmed ball gown would be exactly that for a big, you're not at home in front of the TV that evening. I'm
Exactly.
curious.
Ermine is not TV wearing material.
I wouldn't think so. Uh, it'd get a little hot, right? In Claudia's notes or in the records she left for you, or even in later in Mercedes Bass's notes, did they ever give any indication of what these garments might have cost them? We've had an interesting question about what are we talking about here? That we've alluded to their costs, but what are we actually talking about?
That's a good question. And from the records I've seen, we don't have indications of cost. But I do know that there are ways that you can work with these couture houses to be able to do research in their archives sometimes and get a better understanding of that, and sometimes even pinpoint individual prices, especially because many American clients were not always good at keeping up on their bills. So sometimes these couture houses would even, send out notices, polite reminders to these very elite women that they needed to make good on their debts. Another way we might approach thinking about this is today, there are very few people who purchase haute couture. It is still a very elite system. So most couture houses only have about, a dozen or so clients that are purchasing those couture designs that we see shown in Paris Fashion Week for those couture shows. So often those shows highlight the artisanry of a house and the design that's leading that season. But the pieces that most people engage with are the ready to wear versions that are much more accessibly priced and accessibly accessed, sounds a little redundant. But not everyone can afford to spend weeks on end in Paris having pieces custom fitted and made for their bodies. So not only do these couture pieces start in the tens of thousands of dollars for simple day ensembles, and sometimes in today's money go over $100,000 for really elaborate evening designs with a lot of surface design. Not only do they have this incredible cost associated with them, but also an incredible amount of time associated with them. So that's really another reason I think we need to remember donors in these stories, that they aren't just checkbooks attached to a person, but they are checkbooks attached to people who also have the time and the inclination to use their time to support this system.
And I would say in my own research, and for those of you who are researching, there are some vintage and antiquarian fashion book sellers and ephemera sellers that sell what are known as facture, the bills but from the houses and many times the receipts with the tax stamps and everything. But Annette, you did capture the is it old francs? Is it new francs? How does that translate today? But generally speaking, I've always understood that, you know, new car, dress is generally how some of these go. Well, I'm curious because you have both you have a unique perspective in that you have the archives, the collection, and you see the history, but you also see the new donations and new collectors. Um, how do you think the couture system is changing from say the Balenciaga era through to today with uh, Texas's own now designing for Schiaparelli, a totally different era.
Yeah, I think couture has changed so much as a system, especially if we go from Balenciaga working, especially in the 50s, to what we think of couture as being today. So Balenciaga never had a ready-to-wear line. He was deeply uninterested in making his designs accessible to a lot of people because he was so invested in his the way he artistically engaged with his fashion designs. He was also very uninterested in being a public figure and, doing the kinds of things that are demanded of creative directors of couture houses today. We might also appreciate the way that historically people spent more money on their clothing and had fewer things. So couture was still very, very costly, but was not accessible just to the 1% of the 1%. Historically, it was still very, very elite, but not elite in the way that couture is today. So we might think about, Balenciaga as an example from the past, only making haute couture, not interested in ready to wear, really engaged in artistry and working directly with fabric, sees himself as a designer rather than a creative director, and then that couture is slightly more accessible through the ways that people are allocating their own resources. We might contrast that today with so many of these houses being part of, essentially conglomerates that are viewing fashion houses not as sites of artistic development exclusively, but especially as business opportunities. So thinking about ways of leveraging the history of these brands and the name recognition that they have to then create followings that encourage people to buy ready-to-wear garments, that encourage them to buy tchotchkes that have a brand name on them. I cannot
A
imagine
nice way to put it.
Balenciaga. Exactly. A Balenciaga keychain. I feel like Cristobal would probably be rolling over in his grave at the thought of that. And then we might also think about the way creative directors sort of cycle through so many of these houses and are both expected to sort of encapsulate the design DNA and brand DNA of, a Dior or Chanel. But then they also often have their own design practice outside of that, running their own house or doing other creative directorship work. So we might think about the ways that now creative directors are not seen as stable people or stable contributors, that the brand is the stable thing, and the designers are sort of coming and going and engaging in what I personally feels like is like a media circus compared to Balenciaga, who never wanted to be photographed and was very rarely interviewed.
Yeah, it seems as if they are the designers now are it's ironic. Or I remember you saying that Bill Blass in the day was thought to be out of the workroom of Maurice Rentner because they were just left in the, and now they became the celebrities, and then now they're going back in the, so we fashion is cyclical in that way in its business cycle as well. There was and I'm sorry, I took it a little out of sequence here. Remind us, was there a book or is there a book specifically about Claudia?
Oh, that's a great question. So in Myra Walker's Balenciaga and His Legacy, there is a brief chapter that talks about more in depth about Claudia and her history. She seemed to be a fairly private figure. So, for example, if you do searches through historic newspaper databases, there isn't much to be found that relates to Claudia. Her daughter, I think, was Margarita, and she, I think, continued continued to engage in high fashion, sort of following in her mother's footsteps. But I think it would have been hard for her to, create the close relationship that she had with Balenciaga with another designer. So yeah, I would say there is a bit more information that can be found about Claudia, but really the way that it seems like most people are engaging with understanding her as a historical figure is through our holdings, which again is a testament to the power of fashion and how potent it was as a creative outlet and source of identity for Claudia.
Well, and I would also add, this leads into my next question. It is a credit to the power of your ability to organize all of this, because I have seen the 37 boxes of couture in your hallway. I have seen the, can you end for us on a note of how you organize these? How are you, how do you how do you go about cataloging? We see the stellar pieces that of course should be set aside, but what do you do when 37 boxes of couture show up on your doorstep? Great problem to have.
Yeah, champagne problems, as they say. So what Gordon's alluding to is we recently received a donation of 37 wardrobe boxes full of high design garments, and our collection cannot accept every donation that is offered to us. So we have to make decisions about what comes into our collection and what isn't included. So typically what we do is think about the design and human stories that are already represented in our collection, and then think about ways that prospective donations can help us fill out some of the stories that are underrepresented in our space. So that's not to say that we're trying to identify moments of tokenism where we need to just, fill in a gap, but we really want to think in a robust way about all of the stories that can be told through dress and fashion, and make sure that we have representative examples of as many of those meaningful stories as possible. So with that, we do turn down probably 98% of what people offer us as donations, though there are some people who have really been thoughtful about what they offer us, and they have a higher success rate with us. Once pieces are formally accepted into our collection, they will not be in boxes in the hallway. They will be in our permanent collection storage space, which we do run according to museum and archives best practices. And in that space, our collection is organized in a few ways. First, divided by type of artifact. So clearly shoes have to be stored in a different way than Claudia's ermine evening dress. So we make decisions based on an artifact to artifact basis to decide how best we can keep our materials safe, for decades and hopefully centuries into the future. So for example, our accessories are all individually wrapped in acid-free tissue, marked with their accession numbers or unique identifying numbers assigned to each artifact, and then put in courier-sized boxes that are labeled so we know which objects are in which box. A lot of our collection storage area is hanging storage, which is what you could see in that photograph. Our collection storage area is organized in ways that are both logical and illogical to me, through a system I inherited that includes thinking through gender. So our menswear is kept separate from our women's wear, for better and for worse. Most of our collection is organized alphabetically by designer or design house, really representing the designer driven legacy that we're continuing today. If we don't know a designer, our pieces are organized chronologically by decade. And then if we don't know who made it or when it was made, most of those pieces are traditional cultural dress from around the world. And those right now are organized by accession number, because those accession numbers help us think through clustering things by donor, because we really want to think through who selected those pieces to represent the culture that is baked into those things being created. I often tell the students who visit here, we would never want someone from another country to come to Texas and pick one ensemble to represent Texan fashion and then go back to their country and, offer some sort of like horrible pink felt cowboy hat with rhinestones all over it. While that is one way of representing Texan dress, to have someone who's from outside that culture select how that culture is represented is just really inappropriate in many ways. So we really frame that part of our collection through a donor lens first. I'd really invite you all to come to our space at some point and see how our collection is organized, because it will really make you think through how many many ways we have normalized identity being linked with clothing, or how many ways we limit how we think about historic dress based on these sort of like clumps of information like designer or time period, that thinking outside of those things can often lead to new ways of understanding our artifacts.
And to that point, do we have your contact information? I've had several,
Yes,
if you can share that screen with us, um, or at
let's,
least give us a link
yeah.
to that. We've had several inquiries about getting in touch with you for donations and for further information.
Perfect. So you can find us by looking up Texas
Thank you.
Fashion Collection. Our website is one of those horrible things, tfc.cvad.unt.edu. But because that's as easy as doing a Google search, I would just recommend looking up Texas Fashion Collection. Through that, you can find our website, which has links to the UNT Digital Library to find records that relate to our collection. You can also, through that, find links to our social media pages. So I run our Facebook and Instagram accounts, and you'd be welcome to send me a DM on there if you have a question about anything that you see posted or even some of our professional practices. You can also email me at my work email address, which I'll drop into the chat too. Anyone is welcome to be in contact with me. We do tend to prioritize people who want to learn something with our collection. So whether you're a student at a university, you're an independent scholar, you're in the fashion industry, you're working on a quilt at home and want some inspiration, we're happy to work with people who are researchers, and we define that in a very broad way. So feel free to send me a message, and I'm happy to be as helpful as I possibly can.
Oh, tremendous. Well, thank you. That was incredible. Like I say, I always think I know a fair amount about what you do, and then we have these presentations, and I realize it's just the tip of the iceberg. And thank you for choosing the Lesage and the black and gold. It just happens to be the club colors,
Oh, how perfect.
or at least the colors of our awning. So it's great. So thank you very much, Annette, and thank you all to all of our participants. We had a lively set of questions, a lot of interest in this. I think you're truly our unsung hero of fashion collections, and we look forward to hearing more from you, and good luck on your dissertation.
Thank you so much, Gordon, and thank you to the National Arts Club for hosting this. The programs that you all put together, I think, really enhance a lot of people's understanding of arts and culture and fashion history. And I will be attending many of the rest of Virtual Fashion Week's events.
Thank you. No higher praise. All right. Thank you. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us.